Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving into a really pivotal moment in the civil rights movement today, Selma, 1965. And we're going beyond the typical narrative, the kind of the highlight reel you usually see.
Yeah.
We're going to uncover those complex layers of this event.
It's often seen as the greatest victory of the movement.
Right, exactly.
But it's way more complicated than that.
Yeah, we're going to look at the emotional impact of Bloody Sunday, how it influenced the Voting Rights Act, and even some of the internal struggles within the movement itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
While Selma is often celebrated as this singular triumph, it was also a period of intense debate about the future of the movement itself.
It wasn't just a straight line to victory. So to really get a sense of the significance of Selma, we got to go back to that time. Imagine the fight for basic voting rights, especially in the South. It was incredibly volatile.
Oh, yeah.
And then you have Bloody Sunday, March 7, 1965. This event changes the national conversation completely.
It's forever etched in history. And what's really striking is that this wasn't some hidden injustice. This was hundreds of peaceful marchers trying to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, brutally attacked by state troopers.
Right.
And it wasn't just a couple rogue officers. It was a coordinated assault.
Yeah.
Tear gas, billy clubs. Can you even imagine witnessing that level of brutality on national television?
It was kind of hard to fathom in today's world. So that televised footage, that had to be a turning point, right?
Absolutely. So it's America was forced to look in the mirror and see the ugly truth of racial injustice. People across the country, Chicago, Detroit, New York, Boston, everyone was horrified. Bloody Sunday turned passive sympathy into a demand for change.
Wow. So how did all this public outcry actually turn into political action?
Well, President Johnson was already working on a voting rights bill, but Bloody Sunday just brought this intense sense of urgency. His address to Congress just days after the attack is still considered one of the most powerful speeches in legislative history.
Yeah.
He called out racial discrimination for what it was, a betrayal of American values.
Powerful. And I've heard this speech moved MLK to tears. Is that true?
It did. It was a pivotal moment, and it pushed Congress to finally act. Within months, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was signed into law.
Wow.
That's the power of Selma, the power of public pressure forcing change.
Okay, so the Voting Rights Act itself, what were the specific parts of it that made it so groundbreaking?
It totally changed the game. Literacy tests, which were used to disenfranchise black voters, banned outright.
Wow.
And to ensure fair elections, the act established federal oversight in places with a history of voter suppression. So they sent federal examiners to these areas to guarantee fair voting practices.
So that's the victory that everyone remembers, right? The Voting Rights Act is seen as a direct result of Selma. But you mentioned earlier, the movement wasn't all that unified. What were those internal struggles about?
That's where it gets really interesting. While America was celebrating the Voting Rights Act, tensions within the civil rights movement were escalating, especially between two key organizations, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC led by MLK, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC.
Okay, so unpack that for us. What was causing this friction?
Well, SNCC activists have been working on voter registration in Selma for years before MLK and the SCLC even showed up. Their critique was that the SCLC, with its focus on large-scale demonstrations and all the media attention, was more interested in symbolic victories than in making real lasting changes at the local level.
So it was almost like they came in, grabbed the spotlight, and then left the local activists to pick up the pieces.
Exactly.
It's got to cause some resentment, right?
Oh, yeah. And they had examples to back it up, like what happened in St. Augustine in 1964. SNCC activists felt totally abandoned by the SCLC after their efforts there gained national attention, which later faded, leaving them with a half-won battle.
Wow. So even during this historic victory with the Voting Rights Act, there's all these underlying tensions and disagreements about the best strategies for achieving change.
Exactly. It wasn't just a unified front. These were different organizations with very different approaches. And those differences came to a head in Selma.
This really challenges that simplified narrative of the civil rights movement that we often hear. So if we look deeper at these internal divisions, what were the core philosophical differences between the SCLC and SNCC?
It really comes down to the question of how to achieve lasting change. The SNCC, with leaders like Stokely Carmichael, really believed in grassroots organizing. They were all about empowering local communities to lead the charge for their own liberation.
And the SCLC was more about top-down pressure.
Yeah, they believed in large-scale demonstrations and lobbying the federal government for legislative change. And this difference wasn't just about tactics. It represented a fundamental disagreement about where the true power for change resided. SNCC even accused the SCLC of fostering this culture of leader worship around MLK, suggesting that this reliance on a single charismatic figure actually hindered the movement's long-term goals by overshadowing the collective power of the people.
Fascinating. So as the Voting Rights Act was being celebrated, a new chapter was beginning, one marked by these internal divisions and a growing debate about the future direction of the movement.
Absolutely. And to fully grasp the significance of Selma, we have to understand how these different perspectives shape the movement's trajectory and continue to resonate with social justice movements even today.
All right, we're back and ready to keep going with our look at Selma and its legacy. Before the break, we were discussing those divisions within the civil rights movement itself. You know, it's tempting to just focus on that victory of the Voting Rights Act, but like you were saying, a struggle for true equality, that didn't end there, did it?
Not at all.
Yeah.
The Voting Rights Act was huge, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But it couldn't just magically erase the deeply ingrained racism and the inequality that Black Americans faced every day.
Yeah.
Imagine being a young activist who dedicated their life to this fight, only to realize that progress was going to be slow. Really slow, painfully slow. It's understandable that frustration was building up, especially in groups like SNCC.
Yeah, so there was this feeling that maybe laws alone weren't enough to bring about real change.
Exactly. Many activists, especially the younger generation, started questioning if nonviolent resistance was really working.
Right.
They had been appealing to the nation's conscience, but it often felt like the nation was hesitant to truly acknowledge, let alone fix, its own history of oppression. There's a disillusionment along with the constant threat of violence and discrimination led to a new and powerful force, Black power.
Okay, so we've gone from celebrating the Voting Rights Act to talking about the rise of Black power. Can you connect these two for us?
Sure. The Voting Rights Act tackled a specific problem,
right,
but Black power aimed to address the root causes of inequality.
I see.
It marked a shift away from seeking integration and acceptance within a system that was inherently broken.
Yeah.
It became about Black communities defining their own liberation, embracing their own identity, and building power from within.
So it wasn't just about changing laws, but about changing the whole power structure itself.
Exactly. Black power took on many forms. You had groups like the Black Panther Party, who believed in armed self-defense to combat police brutality. They saw it as a necessary way to protect their communities. Other groups focused on building economic independence and political power within Black communities. There was a strong emphasis on Black pride, celebrating Black culture, reclaiming Black identity.
So it sounds like Black power was less about assimilation and more about empowerment.
I like that. That's a great way to put it. And this shift caused even more tension within the civil rights movement. MLK and the SCLC, they stuck with nonviolent resistance and the pursuit of integration. But their approach was increasingly seen as outdated by many younger activists who wanted more radical and immediate change.
Right. It sounds like there was a generational divide emerging.
Exactly. The older generation had fought so hard for integration, seeing it as the path to equality.
Right.
But the younger generation was saying, hold on, why should we integrate into a system that's rigged against us?
Yeah.
We need to build our own power base.
And where did all of this leave MLK?
It was a tough spot for him. He remained dedicated to his vision of a beloved community, a future where all races could coexist peacefully. But keeping the movement unified was becoming harder and harder. The events of Selma, as triumphant as they were, had revealed these deep divisions and kind of set the stage for the more militant and confrontational era of the late 1960s.
Right. So how did historians capture this tension, this idea that Selma was both a victory and a turning point towards something new and maybe even more radical?
Well, it's fascinating. You have historians like David Garrow arguing that the dramatic events of Bloody Sunday were essential to the passage of the Voting Rights Act.
Okay.
Without that public outcry, they believe, change wouldn't have happened so quickly. So then you have historians like Howard Zinn, who, while acknowledging the importance of the act, point out that it didn't really address the underlying economic inequalities that were at the heart of systemic racism.
So passing a law was one thing, but actually achieving true economic justice, that was a whole other battle.
Exactly. And that's where those different schools of thought offer such valuable insights. The traditionalists emphasize the triumph of nonviolent resistance, leading to policy change, while the continuity school highlights the long and ongoing struggle for Black voting rights.
So it's not just about a single moment in time. but about seeing Selma as part of a much longer fight.
Exactly. And then you have the radical school. They critique the limits of legal solutions like the Voting Rights Act. They argue that real equality requires more than just the right to vote. It requires dismantling the systems that create and maintain those economic and social disparities.
It makes sense. Laws are important, but they don't always lead to real improvements in people's lives.
And that's a key lesson from Selma. The fight for justice is an ongoing process. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
And it's a marathon that was being run on multiple tracks. You had the fight for voting rights, the push for economic justice, and the constant struggle against violence and discrimination. It's a lot to take in, but I think it helps us see just how complex and multifaceted the civil rights movement truly was.
Absolutely. And each one of these threads, each one of these struggles contributes to the rich and complicated legacy of Selma.
So we've talked about those internal tensions, the rise of Black power, and how historians have tried to understand the meaning of Selma. But what about the people of Selma themselves? What happened to the activists in the community? After the media moved on? After the national spotlight faded?
That's a great question, because for the people of Selma, this wasn't just some historical event. It was their lives,
Right.
their right to vote, their right to live with dignity and equality in their own town was on the line.
So what happened to those everyday heroes after the marches were over, after the headlines disappeared? Did the Voting Rights Act actually change their lives?
The Voting Rights Act definitely had a major impact on voter registration. In Selma and across the South, Black voter registration numbers shot up, and Black candidates started winning elections.
It's right.
But the fight for equality didn't end there.
Yeah.
Selma, like many Southern communities, still faced poverty, segregation, and discrimination in housing, education, employment.
Right. So it wasn't just about the ballot box. It was about dismantling an entire system of oppression that had existed for generations.
Exactly. And those local activists, the ones who've been on the front lines long before Selma, they didn't just vanish.
Right.
They continued organizing and advocating for their community. They understood that real equality needed more than just laws. It needed a fundamental shift in power and resources.
It reminds us that real lasting change takes sustained effort. It's a long-term commitment to justice.
I agree. And I think the people of Selma, with their unwavering dedication to their community, offer a really powerful example for anyone working towards a more just and equitable world.
Their story shows the power of grassroots activism and the importance of never losing hope, even when facing huge challenges.
I think that's a great place to pause for now. We'll be right back to examine the lasting impact of Selma and what it can teach us about the fight for social justice today.
We're back for our final look at Selma. You know, we've covered a lot, the events, the different historical views, the impact on the movement. But I keep coming back to this one question.
I think I know what you're getting at, the big so what, right? What does Selma, with all its complexities, actually mean for us today?
You got it. We've established that Selma was way more than a single victory. It was a turning point that revealed those deep divisions and kind of sparked new challenges. How can understanding this event, with all its different layers, how can that inform our approach to the social justice movements that are happening right now?
Well, that's where the real lessons come in. Selma gives us this powerful framework for thinking about modern social movements and the obstacles they run into. It's like holding up a mirror to the present and asking ourselves, how much have we actually changed?
Yeah.
Think about it. We've seen echoes of Bloody Sunday, even in recent years. Peaceful protesters met with excessive force. It raises tough questions about how far we've come in protecting civil rights.
It's really disheartening to see those images and to realize that that fight for basic human dignity and equality, it's not over. It makes Selma feel so much more relevant today.
It does. And just like we saw in Selma's aftermath, there's a similar spectrum of opinions and approaches within today's movements.
Yeah.
That debate between nonviolent resistance and more confrontational methods, the tension between folks focused on legislative reform versus those pushing for grassroots organizing and community empowerment.
It's like that split between SNCC and SCLC that we talked about.
Exactly. Selma shows us that movements are rarely unified. They're made up of individuals with different backgrounds, beliefs, and strategies. The real test is bridging those gaps, building coalitions, and finding common ground to work towards that shared vision of justice.
So if we could pull out some key lessons from Selma, for activists and organizers today, what would they be? What are those lasting takeaways we can apply to our own time?
I'd say the biggest one is never underestimate the power of collective action. Selma showed us that when people unite, raise their voices and demand change, they can make the impossible happen. It's a reminder that even when the obstacles seem huge, hope is never lost, and change is always possible.
That's powerful. But it's also a call to action, right? It's on us to carry that legacy forward.
I agree completely. And another crucial lesson is that the fight for social justice, it's a long game. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah.
There will be wins and losses, moments of progress and times of frustration.
Resilience is so important.
It's crucial. And so is adaptability. We need to constantly assess our methods, figure out what's working and what's not, and stay open to new ideas and approaches. The fight for justice demands persistence, but also flexibility.
And I think Selma also highlights this fact, that true equality goes beyond just changing laws. It's about getting at the root causes of inequality, those systemic issues that create and perpetuate injustice.
Exactly. It's about dismantling racism, sexism, homophobia, all forms of oppression that hold people back and deny them their full potential. It's about building a world where everyone can thrive, no matter who they are or where they come from.
That's a vision worth fighting for. And Selma, with all its complexity and its lessons, gives us a map for navigating this journey. It's not just a historical event, it's a living legacy.
I love that. Selma's legacy continues to inspire and challenge us to push for a more just and equitable world.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Selma 1965. I hope this has been insightful and thought-provoking for you. We've journeyed through a pivotal moment in history, a moment that still shapes us today and inspires us for the future.
It's been my pleasure exploring these crucial questions with you.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better world.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.